Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Today we'll be doing a deep dive on this biographical book, The Nigerian Revolution and the Biafran War by Alexander A. Madiebo. The book was first published in 1980 by Fourth Dimension Publishing Company Limited, 179 Zik Avenue, PMB 1164, Enugu, Nigeria. And so Major General Madiebo retired, joined the Nigerian Army in May 1954 as an officer cadet. His military training was undertaken at the Regular Officer Special Training School, ROSTS, in Teshi, Ghana, Eaton Hall Officer Cadet School in Chester, England, and Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst in Camberley, England. He was commissioned into the Nigerian Army Artillery with the rank of Second Lieutenant in December 1956. He took part as troop commander of the Reconnaissance Squadron in the Cameroon Uprising and in Kinshasa. Before returning to the Congo, now Zaire, in late 1962, he served in Ibadan as the adjutant of the 3rd Nigerian Battalion during the political crisis of that year. He returned to England and the US for further training in 1963 to 1964 and became the first regimental commander of the Nigerian Army Artillery Regiment in July 1964. During the Nigerian Biafra War, he first commanded Biafra's 51 Brigade for 2 months before assuming full command of the Biafran Army with the rank of Major General from September 1967 to the end of the war. This is the author's preface. This book is not intended to serve as political propaganda material for the benefit of any section or group of individuals. It is rather a genuine attempt on my part to render a dispassionate account of the Nigerian Revolution and the Civil War which took place from January 1966 to January 1970. I believe I owe it as a duty to Nigerians, particularly and indeed to the rest of the world, to initiate a postmortem on those events in which I was deeply involved, first as the head of the Nigerian Army Artillery and later as the general officer that commanded the Biafran Army throughout the war. I believe the world would like to know why it was necessary for some army officers in Nigeria to topple their civil government in January 1966 in order, as they claimed, to ensure that Nigeria remained united and stable. I am sure many people would like to know why the tremendous joy and happiness expressed by all Nigerians in support of that coup appear to have been short-lived. Some people may want to know why a section of Nigeria later reacted very violently against that coup by first carrying out massive civil riots in May 1966, which cost the country over 3,000 lives, quickly followed by a military counter-coup and pogrom also directed against the same people at an estimated cost of over 50,000 lives, all in an attempt to succeed from the rest of the Federation of Nigeria. Serious doubts may still exist in many minds as to why Lieutenant Colonel Gowon suddenly did a complete turnabout and, rather than succeed as he had originally planned and said, preferred to plunge Nigeria into a civil war which took a toll of an estimated 3 million lives in an attempt to reunite the same Nigeria he had set out initially to break up. Most important of all is that those who made up Biafra and the rest of mankind may like to read authentic eyewitness accounts and inside stories of how Biafra fought a war with virtually nothing and yet survived for almost 3 years under a total blockade and complete isolation from the rest of the world. For Biafrans, such an account becomes vital if they are to appreciate fully their extraordinary courage and achievements as well as their sad mistakes during that war which they had to fight. On the other hand, armed with some important facts about the revolution and the war, the world, particularly the powers that be, will be in a position to judge more realistically the role Biafrans played. It is also hoped that if this book can clear the existing doubts by presenting the facts, sufficient lessons may be learnt by those presently in a position of power to discourage a reoccurrence of a catastrophe of that magnitude anywhere in Black Africa. The confusion that exists has been provoked and encouraged by a spate of books containing inaccuracies and misinformation, which have been written and published in New York, London, and Paris during and since the war. Finally, I seized this opportunity, an opportunity I never had before, to express my gratitude and thanks to the members of the army and the civil population of Biafra for the support they gave me during the war as the general officer commanding the Biafran army, Major General Alexander Madiebo. I'd like to ask my audience to be civil in the comments. Remember, this is history and we're all learning. If you enjoy what I do, go ahead, like, subscribe, share, give us a thumbs up, leave us a comment, and we'll see you in the next video. Major Hassan Katsina, Inspector of the Reconnaissance Regiment, and I traveled together to Lagos from Kaduna on 10th January 1966 to attend a conference on the purchase of new equipment for our respective units. At the airport also was Major Chukwuma Nzeogwu, who had come to see off a colleague of his, Major Wole Ademoyega, who was also traveling to Lagos after a short visit to see Nzeogwu in Kaduna. I can well remember Major Nzeogwu in a conversation with Mrs. Katsina at the airport, asking her some searching but apparently irrelevant questions, such as where her baby was due, how many children she had and their ages, how many more children she would like to have, and so on. Mrs. Katsina answered these questions very patiently, and it is possible that her answers may have saved her husband's life during the coup that followed 5 days later. When the plane touched down at Ikeja Airport, a big American car belonging to the Minister of Lagos Affairs, Alhaji Yaradua, whisked Katsina away to the plush residential area of Lagos called Ikoyi. Major Ademoyega, cuddling a big briefcase, disappeared into the crowd, while Major Eze took me in his car to the officers' mess at Apapa, the principal port of Nigeria in Lagos. For various reasons, the brigade commanders, battalion commanders, and most of the other senior military officers were either already in Lagos or were being expected. Most of these senior officers were booked in Ikoyi Hotel, but twice in my first 2 days in Lagos, Major Christian Anuforo, the staff officer in Army headquarters responsible for arranging accommodation for these officers, attempted to oust me from the mess VIP chalet where I was staying in order to put Brigadier Ademulegun, who was being expected from Ghana. When the brigadier came in, he chose to stay in a private accommodation. Judging from subsequent events, it would appear Anuforo was merely trying to put the brigadier where he could easily be held. His decision to stay in an undisclosed private lodging on the 12th of January 1966 may have contributed to the postponement of the date of the coup. While in Lagos, a few officers, through their conversations with me, gave clear indication that they were, as individuals, dissatisfied to the extent of resorting to violence if need be, to rectify their personal and national grievances. No one, however, made it known to me that a definite decision had been taken by some of them to carry out a coup. Major Emmanuel Ifejuna, for instance, invited me for lunch, during which he expressed the view that an immediate coup was the only solution to the nation's numerous political problems. In agreeing with him, I expressed my doubt on the chances of success of such an exercise in a country where tribal loyalties were much stronger than the national and ideological ones. He immediately changed the topic of the conversation and never mentioned it again. Also, Major Donatus Okafo, later buried alive for his involvement in the January 1966 coup as the commander of the Federal Guards, had the occasion to speak to me angrily over his problem with the commander of 2 Brigade, Brigadier Zachary May Malari. Major Okafo said it was his immediate intention to deal with May Malari before May Malari succeeded in dismissing him from the army for punishing a northern soldier who went absent without leave. In another conversation, Major Anuforo condemned Colonel Yakubu Pam, the Adjutant General and a northerner from Jos, for being too brutal to thief rioters of northern Nigeria while he was in charge of operations there as commander of 3rd Battalion. Talking of Pam, Anuforo commented that an officer who had caused the death of so many people should be punished. The comments and opinions of these officers meant very little to me then, but became very significant when those same officers turned out to be the leaders of the January coup in Lagos. I left Lagos for Kaduna on the morning of the 13th of January with Hassan Katsina. Major Alphonsus Keshi, the Brigade Major 1st Brigade, telephoned my house at 0545 hours on the 15th of January 1966 to inform me that a coup had started at midnight and was still going on. According to him, the coup was being led by Major Nzeogwu and appeared to be going on successfully. It had already resulted in the death of some senior military and civilian leaders, including Brigadier Ademulegun, Colonel Ralph Shodeinde, the commandant of NMTC, the Sardauna, the Premier, and a few others. Major Keshi condemned the whole exercise but requested that I come down to the brigade headquarters to assist him in handling the very explosive situation. I considered a hasty move through the town to the brigade headquarters unwise at that stage, for I was yet ignorant of Major Keshi's real role and my relationship with those executing the coup. My first reaction was to walk across to the nearby artillery officers' mess and alert my officers. There I found only a young northern Nigerian, 2nd Lieutenant Nasco, who told me that all other unit officers had gone on a night exercise and were not yet back. I briefed him on the situation without going into the details of casualties and instructed him to go immediately to the unit and alert the men and await my arrival. I got to my office soon afterwards and discovered that those unit officers on the exercise took with them almost all the guns and a good quantity of ammunition, as well as most of the serviceable motor vehicles. As these were not authorized for this exercise, it became clear that they were part of the coup, even though there was no shelling going on. I spoke to what was left of the units on the situation and asked them to prepare to repel any attack from any quarter. In addition, the remaining vehicles were fueled, ready to move troops to anywhere on orders from the competent authority. At 0900 hours of January 16, 1966, the young officers under me who took part in the coup, Lieutenant Bob Ebiketo and Olafemi Young, came back to the unit and reported in my office. They talked glibly about how they had gone on an authorized exercise during which they suddenly realized it was a coup and they were forced to take part against their will. I could not possibly believe them because of the amount of equipment and ammunition they took away without my permission. As a matter of fact, I thought they were sounding my opinion in order to report back to Nzeogwu. Therefore, when they wanted to know from me whether to continue to back Nzeogwu or revert to the normal channel of command, I humorously told them to render to Nzeogwu what was his and to the old establishment what was theirs. I, however, advised them to return the guns to barracks as they were unnecessary for the exercise they were doing. Needless to say, they failed to carry out this instruction. There was no doubt they may even have shot me if I had given them the slightest indication of disapproval of the revolution, judging from the ferocity of their looks and how well armed they were even in my office. Probably they were acting under instructions. Shortly after the departure, Major Israel Okoro, the second in command of the 3rd Battalion, came into my office looking quite ruffled and nervous. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel George Kurobo, had suddenly left Kaduna the previous afternoon by air to Lagos without explanation. There was a chance that he had been tipped off. Okoro therefore found himself commanding the battalion on this turbulent day. Major Okoro advised that I disarm and stand down my troops to avoid a misunderstanding and perhaps a confrontation with Nzeogwu, who he said was already in full control of all military units in Kaduna. He knew much more of what was happening than I did, for he had already gone to see Nzeogwu, who was now occupying the brigade commander's seat and issuing instructions to the entire brigade. He also confirmed the death of those already mentioned earlier by Major Keshi. Major Okoro told me of how he was awakened at midnight by a group of soldiers led by Captain Timothy Onwategu after they had gained forced entry into the house. Onwategu had told Okoro what was happening and demanded to know his opinion. Naturally, he declared his full and unqualified support with all those rifles pointing menacingly at him. While Okoro was still there, I telephoned the 5th Battalion, Kano, and spoke to Commanding Officer Lieutenant Colonel Ojukwu. When I had told him what was happening in Kaduna, his only comment was a series of good, good, good. I rang off and promised to telephone him again, which I never did. It was difficult from this telephone conversation to guess what his real views and stand were, and I'm sure he also did not know what I was thinking. However, it seemed that Ojukwu already knew of all that I told him. On the advice of Okoro, the two of us drove down to the brigade headquarters to see Nzeogwu. When we arrived, Nzeogwu was sitting in the brigade commander's office with a heavily bandaged neck, surrounded by soldiers of northern Nigeria origin. There was no doubt he was in pain but appeared calm and very serious. He expressed delight in seeing me, and from then on, not only did he confide completely in me, he accepted the advice I gave him right to the end of his regime. He explained that the aim of the revolution was to get rid of the corrupt and incorrigible politicians and have them replaced with true nationalists. He regretted that it had become necessary to use force to do this when it could have been done through a democratic election, a system which was no longer possible in Nigeria. Nzeogwu then gave me a quick briefing on what he had done so far and expressed satisfaction with the progress of the revolution in northern Nigeria. He disclosed that it had been his intention to carry out the revolution in December 1965 at Enugu during the annual Army Inter-Unit Shooting Competition, which was to have been attended by all senior army officers, including Ironsi, the general officer commanding. According to Nzeogwu, he had arranged to round up all senior officers and put them under sedation until he had peacefully taken over the government. The plan was shelved and the date postponed because Brigadier Sam Ademulegun and a few others failed to attend. He added that he had given instructions that I should not be disturbed the previous night because he expected I would join the revolution when I learned of it. I thanked him for reposing so much confidence in me and congratulated him for his efforts and achievements. I, however, advised him to go to the hospital and get good treatment for his neck, which he injured as a result of a grenade explosion during his encounter with the Sardauna in his house during the night of the coup. He rejected this and preferred to have all treatment he needed in the office. The governor of northern Nigeria, Sir Kashim Ibrahim, was being held prisoner in the brigade major's office while many northern Nigerian soldiers surrounded the building, demanding that he be killed for his important role in a regime of corruption, oppression and dishonesty. I clearly overheard Captain Nzeogwu trying very hard to convince the soldiers to spare the life of the governor, and later threatening that the governor could only be killed over his dead body. In the end, Nzeogwu, with the timely intervention of Nzeogwu, saved the governor's life. Explaining later his reasons for protecting the governor's life, Nzeogwu said he was personally responsible for arresting the governor during the night of the revolution. What had impressed him was that the governor, unlike many others, had behaved towards him very well and had given him full cooperation during the arrest. Judging from the soldiers in the brigade headquarters, it was very striking that Nzeogwu was conducting his coup almost entirely with soldiers of northern Nigerian origin. His medical attendants, driver, escorts and guards were all northern soldiers, and he only ate meals prepared by his northern batman. Nzeogwu was a southern Nigerian. Because of Nzeogwu's intention to replace the old politicians with what he called honest progressives who could work under military supervision, he prepared a pro forma to be signed by all politicians, pledging their loyalty to the new regime and promising not to engage in any political or other activities likely to obstruct or retard the progress of the revolution. All the politicians who were in Kaduna at the time of the coup signed this form before they left for their villages. Top civil servants were called into Nzeogwu's headquarters and after pledging their loyalty were briefed on their new duties under the new regime. As I observed these civil servants coming in and out of the headquarters, their faces portrayed nothing but joy and excitement. The only visible exception was perhaps Alhaji Ali Akilu, the secretary to the late premier, whom Nzeogwu, however, intended to arrest as a likely obstacle to the cause of the revolution. I personally thought his arrest would do more harm than good because it could not be justified at the time and could be misunderstood to be victimization. Other officers held the same view and the idea was dropped by Nzeogwu. Alhaji Yusufu, the Commissioner of Police for Northern Nigeria, also showed open resentment over the conduct of the revolution and in fact refused to go and see Nzeogwu when he sent for him. But for my timely intervention, he could have lost his life, for soldiers had been detailed to go and gun him down. I promised Nzeogwu I was going to speak to the commissioner, and if I failed to get him realigned, action could be taken against him. I later visited Yusufu in his office at the police headquarters, and after a chat with him, he realized the foolishness of his obstinacy. He later came down to the headquarters to make up with Nzeogwu and pledged his loyalty. From then on, he carried out all instructions issued to him by the leaders of the revolution. I had been in the brigade headquarters for over 3 hours and had not seen Major Katsina or even heard his name mentioned. I developed a suspicion that he may have been killed during the night as well, for inside Nzeogwu's headquarters, no one talked about the dead. I telephoned the reconnaissance unit from the brigade major's office and was told that Katsina was in the house. I drove to his house to ensure that this was true, and there I found a nervous, absolutely shaking Katsina holding fast to a glass of whiskey he was carrying. His wife and children were with him, and every minute his wife stood up and peeped out of the window to reassure herself all was still well. According to Katsina, he knew about the coup at about 0430 hours on the 15th and then went straight to his unit to alert his troops. He was still addressing them and getting them prepared for action when Major Nzeogwu himself came in with a few soldiers. Nzeogwu, Katsina said, asked him on which side he was, on the side of the revolution or on the side of the old establishments. Katsina said he had no choice but to declare his support for Nzeogwu. But on further reflection, he was more convinced that Nzeogwu's exercise was justifiable. Having got his assurance, Katsina went on. Nzeogwu shook hands with him, ordered that the remaining armored vehicles in the unit should be dispatched to the brigade headquarters, and left amidst cheers from all the men on the parade. I later had lunch with Katsina and left him much more relaxed. News about the conduct and progress of the coup in Lagos began to trickle in by midday, and it appeared things were not moving well for the revolutionaries. At best, they could be said to be partially successful, with a task well planned but badly executed. Sir Abubakar, the Prime Minister, Chief Festus Okotie-Eboh, Federal Minister of Finance, Chief Akintola, Premier, Western Nigeria, Brigadier Mai Malari, Commander 2nd Brigade, Colonel Lagama, Commanding Officer 4th Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Pam, Adjutant General Army Headquarters, and Lieutenant Colonel Unegbe, Quartermaster General, were all reportedly killed or missing. It also appeared as if General Ironsi was successfully foiling the coup in southern Nigeria, thereby forcing the young officers who started it to flee into hiding in panic and fear. Soon after this, what was left of the civilian regime quickly handed over full responsibility for the government of Nigeria to Ironsi. Nzeogwu was utterly disappointed with this development and began to plan a deliberate attack on the south to crush Ironsi's men. He blamed his failure on certain officers who had failed to implement their part of the coup, even though they had given their full support during the planning stages. Nzeogwu's opinion was that this sudden betrayal deserved punishment because it was due more to consideration of personal reward by Ironsi than to cowardice. The following day, the 16th of January 1966, Major Nzeogwu called a conference of all officers in Kaduna to brief them on what had been achieved and to issue instructions for future operations. Addressing the conference, Nzeogwu stressed his determination to deal ruthlessly with those who showed signs of sitting on the fence and the opportunists. In this connection, he announced that Ojukwu and Katsina were enemies of the revolution and would be disposed of as soon as possible. He accused Katsina of showing insufficient interest in the revolution by never showing up at the brigade headquarters and failing to attend the conference without excuses. He accused Ojukwu of being a letdown for reasons best known only to Nzeogwu himself. On my advice in the conference hall, Nzeogwu agreed to give Ojukwu one more chance of joining the revolution and immediately appointed me to go to Kano and find out from him what his real stand was. While in Kano, Nzeogwu also wanted me to collect £500,000 from the central bank for the payment of soldiers in northern Nigeria under his command. Speaking about future operations, Nzeogwu announced he had grouped all forces under his control into 3 task forces. The first task force was given the task of moving further north to Zaria and Kano to consolidate his control on those areas and to remove all opposition where it still existed. The second task force had the assignment of moving through Jeba to take Ibadan, the capital of Western Nigeria, and subsequently Lagos. The third task force was to move on the eastern axis through Makurdi to take Enugu, the capital of eastern Nigeria, and later Benin, the capital of midwestern Nigeria. The task of the Nigerian Air Force was to fit machine guns to their training aircrafts in preparation for strafing and bombing Lagos when orders were given after the fall of Ibadan. The Air Force bombs were to be hand grenades, and the pilots were already practicing at the outskirts of Kaduna how to strafe with machine guns and release grenades from their planes. Most, if not all, the officers attending this conference listened to Nzeogwu's orders with absolute joy and excitement. When Nzeogwu in conclusion said, "Nigeria has a population of 50 million. We can afford and we are prepared to sacrifice 1 million to achieve our aims and objectives," the conference hall was virtually brought down by the applause of the young officers. The D-Day was to be the 18th of January 1966, and each task force had artillery and armored vehicles in support. Before the end of the conference, Major Ukbu Isong, a Calabar officer under Katsina's command, was appointed by Nzeogwu to take a small force and go and arrest Katsina with orders to shoot him if he resisted. Alone with Nzeogwu in his office after the conference, I very carefully and cautiously disagreed with his plan and future intentions. I argued that I was the wrong person to go to Kano to meet Ojukwu as well as collect soldiers' pay because my presence was necessary in Kaduna at all times. For this task, I thought a junior officer would do. Nzeogwu accepted his suggestion. Also, I advised that Katsina should not be persuaded to come down to the headquarters as opposed to his being arrested. I thought no harm ought to come to him until it was positively proved beyond all doubt that he was against the revolution. Finally, I advised Nzeogwu again, rightly or wrongly, to give up the idea of launching an attack on the South. My points of arguments were that the civil regime had been overthrown and the army was in control of the federal government, thus fulfilling his overall aim. If he therefore attacked southern Nigeria, it would be seen as a military struggle for a power between him and Ironsi, a struggle which could degenerate into a civil war and bloodbath.
Now, what are your relations with General Ironsi in Lagos?
Well, very good. He's my boss. I have always been under him, and I still am under him. There isn't really any problem with you. Misunderstandings arose, but this was due to the publication in the press and by announcements over the radio. At one time, they started calling us in Kaduna rebels, whereas in fact the revolution was all a planned affair all over the country.
Moreover, I thought Nzeogwu would very easily and quickly lose his military advantage over Ironsi, who was in a position to call for outside military assistance. Soon afterwards, on the evening of the 16th of January, news came from Kano that Captain Ude, who had gone there with a message from Nzeogwu for Ojukwu, was under arrest and was being held in the 5th Battalion guard room. The following day, when I got to the brigade headquarters in the morning, there was tension and feverish activity. Outside the headquarters, a strong company group supported by 2 ferrets and a Saladin armored car formed up under Captain Onwategu, an instructor under Nzeogwu at the military college. This force, as I soon found out, was about to leave for Kano to ensure that 5th Battalion joined the revolution. The instruction was to avoid the use of force and the consequent loss of lives unless it became necessary. Realizing that the special task force was formed to do battle in Kano, I convinced Nzeogwu to cancel the operation, and he did so. He then asked me to devise a more peaceful means of ensuring the full cooperation of the 5th Battalion in Kano and the release of Captain Ude from arrests. I had by now discouraged all future operations, and in my attempt to get a quick and tidy end to Nzeogwu's revolution, I had created a stalemate. Ironsi was sitting in Lagos, ruling the south, and Nzeogwu was ruling the north from Kaduna, and there was no real link or dialogue between the two of them. I thought Nzeogwu should submit to Ironsi, and for this reason I began to speak to him about the need for a unified military leadership of the nation under Ironsi. I also pointed out that unless the wandering troops were disarmed and sent back to the barracks at once, they could eventually get out of hand. Already, numerous illegal roadblocks had been set up all over the towns where the army had stationed in northern Nigeria by soldiers of all military units, and civilians were being disposed and molested. On my initiative, I had ordered the gunners deployed in Kaduna town to go back to barracks with their guns. but they refused to do so unless the instructions came from Nzeogwu. Later that day, both Ironsi and Gowon spoke to me over the telephone. Ironsi said my new task was to bring Nzeogwu down to Lagos, dead or alive, and then handed me over to Gowon to work out the details of how that was to be done with him. Over the telephone, Gowon passionately described how he had come back from Britain on the night of 14th January 1966, a day before the coup started. Gowon narrated the story of his narrow escapes from death in the hands of the revolutionaries who he said were after him the whole night and throughout the following day. He suggested that I find sufficient troops to attack and destroy Nzeogwu. I refused to do this because, as I told him, all troops were already under Nzeogwu's control in the north. In addition, I pointed out that even if troops were available, it would be unwise on my part to fight against what appeared to be a popular revolution. Gowon then suggested that I should arrange with a doctor to sedate Nzeogwu while appearing to be treating his injured neck. Nzeogwu could then be brought down to Lagos in that state. I once again had many reasons why this could not be done. Foremost among them was the fact that the only one doctor in northern Nigeria at that treated Nzeogwu, and this doctor would definitely not have consented to such a suggestion. I explained to Gowon that the coup was completely over in the north and Nzeogwu was prepared to settle with Lagos under two main conditions. One was a guarantee of safety for himself and others who took part in the coup, and the other was an assurance that the aims of the revolution would be upheld at all times by the Lagos regime. Later, I telephoned Ironsi again and gave him those conditions as demanded by Nzeogwu and promised to convince Nzeogwu to hand over power completely to him if these assurances were honestly given. Ironsi accepted the conditions and invited Nzeogwu to Lagos. Nzeogwu formally handed over power to Ironsi and agreed to go to Lagos in a telephone conversation during the evening of the 18th January 1966. This enabled Ironsi to announce the appointment of military governors, one for each of the four regions, the North, West, East, and the Midwest. Major Katsina was appointed governor of the North, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Fajuyi for the West, Ejo for the Midwest, and Ojukwu for the East. Immediately after the announcement of the new governors, Major Keshi, the brigade major 1st Brigade, telephoned my house to say that, in his view, the appointment of one of the military governors was a grievous mistake. Major Keshi also expressed the same view to Nzeogwu, who said he would take up the matter with Ironsi when he arrived in Lagos. He thought that, by that appointment, cowardice had been rewarded in a revolution designed to bring to the forefront only the best the nation could muster. Nzeogwu also felt that Ironsi ought to move the new governors to regions other than their regions of origin. By the time Colonel Conrad Nwawu, military attaché, Nigerian High Commission, London, traveled from Lagos to Kaduna to escort Nzeogwu to Lagos, all was already set for his departure. On 20th January 1966, in a short ceremony outside the brigade headquarters, Nzeogwu handed over the affairs of northern Nigeria to the newly appointed governor, Katsina. Katsina made a short speech in praise and support of Nzeogwu and all he stood for and fought for. In the presence of the world press and radio, including the British Broadcasting Corporation, he expressed his determination to ensure that Nzeogwu's efforts would not be in vain. In a show of great emotion, Katsina embraced Nzeogwu before his final departure. The January coup was widely acclaimed all over the country, including the northern region, where top civil servants celebrated its success and apparently happy ending by holding parties both in their homes and in public places. Acting against my advice that it was improper from the protocol point of view, Katsina visited my house immediately after his appointment. He brought with him his entire entourage of police outriders and patrol cars and a carload of drinks. We all drank to the health of Ironsi. We drank to the health of the new governors. We drank to the survival of a new Nigeria. Katsina would probably say now, I did all that to deceive old Alex into believing all was well. I sincerely believed that he was acting in good faith that night. We drank the toasts. Western Nigeria probably benefited most from this revolutionary turn of events. The military takeover brought to an end a long nightmare of bloody riots which were triggered off by the rigged Western Nigerian parliamentary elections. In the East, Midwest, and Lagos, the entire people and press hailed the change with absolute joy and optimism for the emergence of a new Nigeria free from corruption, tribalism, and nepotism. Therefore, when people argue nowadays that Eastern Nigerians were massacred in retaliation for their role in the January coup, it sounds ridiculous. The January Revolution was not a total failure, for it achieved its primary objective, the removal of the discredited civilian regime. What went wrong was the inability of the coup to exploit its success. When, therefore, the inevitable counter-coup came, the Ironsi regime wobbled and collapsed. It may be relevant to mention that the coup only attained limited success in Lagos because Nzeogwu, in his determination to ensure success, selected Majors Ifejuna Anuforo, Okafor, and Ademoyega, officers who had personal grievances against various senior military commanders, to lead it in the federal capital. The personal grievances clouded their thoughts and unfortunately adversely affected their judgments and therefore the entire Lagos operations. Without doubt, it could now be argued that if Nzeogwu had been given a free hand to kill Ojukwu, Katsina, Jesufu, and Ali Akilu, and then attack the south as he intended to do, things might have developed differently in one way or the other in Nigeria. Against this argument, one can only bear in mind that it could have been worse. But then the disaster that followed the coup was entirely due to weakness and lack of clear, realistic political objectives and discipline on the part of the military regime which inherited power. The January coup was sufficiently successful for that regime to have rectified whatever was done badly and still retain power, discipline, and respect. What happened was that Nigeria, which was being treated for an overdose of compromise by those who carried out the coup, was being administered with more doses of compromise by Ironsi's regime, which inherited power after the revolution.